after his funeral, my older brothers sort of pulled me aside, and then, we were talking one night just as siblings do, and they were like, when you were born, not long after you were born, or when you were young, a baby toddler, Dad pulled us aside and said, your brother is completely different to you guys, and you really have to look out for him.
Really?
Which was an incredible thing to hear all those years later as adults. So he knew straight away. He'd pull the boys aside and he was like, you always need to look after Edward. He's not like you two.
Oh. Hi, my name is Kay Anderson, and you are listening to Lost Spaces, the show that's all about lost queer spaces. Only it's not really all about lost queer spaces. It's focused more on the memories of the people who drank there and danced there and loved there. Every week I talk to a different person and I find out what relationship they had with a particular queer space and also how it helped shape the person that they've become. So one of the things I get asked a lot when people find out that I do this show is something along the lines of, well, why are queer spaces important? I mean, bars and clubs close all the time, right? Why should we care about them just because they're queer? And there are lots of answers to that question, but the one that I keep coming back to, and the one that I think is probably the most important, is that they aren't just businesses. They're not just there to make money. They are community hubs, they're late-night befriending services, and they are places where people get to explore and push themselves and figure out what they like and what they don't like. And I think that's just so much more important than straight bars. Sorry to anyone who's listening who might prefer straight bars. Anyway, it was wonderful to be reminded of all of that in this week's conversation, which also, sidebar, happens to be our first ever episode focused on a lost space in New Zealand. So I'm really excited about that, and I'm trying as much as I can not to put on my Kiwi accent. So you are spared. You can thank me for sparing you, but also, I just really want to say New Zealand. Oh, I said it, sorry. Anyway, so I got to talk to Edward Cowley, who you might know by his drag alter ego Buckwheat, about The Staircase, which was a legendary space, or rather spaces because it moved to a few different venues over its time, in Auckland, New Zealand, obviously. And it was here that Edward first started going out when he was underage and before homosexuality was even legal in the country. And he started to do drag here, and he even went on to be a co-owner of the space. And when he was co-owner, he made sure that community and togetherness and service were at the heart of that business, which is what made it such a special, fantastic, wonderful space. But we will find out more about that as we get into the episode. Before we get into it, did you know that I have a weekly newsletter which is called Queer Word? It's a fun 5-minute read that shares a queer word, tells you about what it means, and then gives you a little bit of history and some fun facts around the term. So to give you a clue of what it talks about, recent issues have covered the history of the word cottaging, the difference between the term kai and kiki, and an alternative word that was used to describe homosexuals before the word homosexual existed. So kind of go through history, go through different sub-communities within the queer umbrella, dare I say, and just try to educate and have a little bit of fun. So if that sounds like your thing, I will include the newsletter sign up in the show notes for this episode. And yeah, I'd love to be in your inbox every week. I think that'd be fun. Right, enough of me babbling. Why don't we get into the episode?
When I look at my parents, when I look at my sisters, when I look at other Samoan or Pacific men of my age, we are all cut from the same cloth. I'm not sure what it was that our parents sort of taught
What
us.
kind of cloth is it? Is it cotton? Vinyl?
Probably linen.
Linen? Okay.
A little bit of sequin.
Oh, yeah. Need a bit of zhuzh in there.
Not disco sequin anymore. I've been elevated to beading.
Oh, she fancy.
Mm.
Anyway, sorry, I cut you off. Cut from the same cloth.
Just in terms of sort of our approach to things. So it's almost as if there was a generation of people that were all taught, that came out of the Pacific, they were all schooled in the same way. I think when I look back at that now, our parents were preparing us for life in a foreign land, really. So whilst I was born here, I came from a wave of migrants that, when I sort of look at lots of my community now, a lot of them, Pacific people in New Zealand haven't prospered. Some of us have, a lot of us haven't, for whatever reason. But part of me being Pacific, so my queerness and my gayness is probably, the third or fourth thing down the line in terms of my identity. First and foremost, I'm Samoan. First and foremost, I'm, Cowley, Thai. Although my parents were born in Samoa, I have a strong affinity for that country, even though I never went there. I was living in Sydney in the UK before I went to Samoa. But there's something about sort of migrants, or the migration of my family and Pacific people here, that gave us really strong connections to a land that we hadn't been to.
So let's pick up on this hierarchy of identities, because I always think identities are kind of like on a continuum rather than on a list. This might be semantics, but so can you view your queerness as below other parts of your identity, not sitting alongside them?
Well, not below, but it's not. Yeah, I've met gay people and queer people who, for them, that's the first thing they are. And whilst it's something I am, it's not the first thing I am. I'm a member of a family. I'm a member of a community that is my Pacific self before I'm a member of my queer community. And often... Ooh. The queer construct for Pacific people or for Samoan people, there is no word for gay in the Samoan context. And I've had aunts that have been living together forever, and they're just the aunties. In the Pacific culture, it's okay to be who you are. It's not okay to talk about it and scream it, I'm loud, I'm proud, and wave my flag. That was the difference. So when I was growing up, my family, obviously, they knew I was gay. We never had to talk about it. There was never any coming out. And when I look at the history throughout the Pacific, or throughout Samoa in particular, it is okay to be gay and to live with another same-sex partner, and everyone is happy with that. Everyone is not happy with it when you are a gay couple who want to bring a pride parade down the street.
I have a lot of thoughts.
So coming out from now as a Western construct, and it was just something that never needed to be said. You could just be. Straight people don't have a coming out, they just are.
No, but it's almost like I don't mind if you're gay as long as you don't shove it in my face, which is essentially saying just never ever mention a key part of who you are and what you might be getting up to when you go home. It's under the guise of being accepting and tolerant, but kind of isn't.
Do you think? See, I don't think that. I used to think that. And now when I look back at it, I'm kind of like, so people could just be who they were without having to identify who they were. Straight people don't. They live together, they just are.
Well, yeah, and that is wonderful if you can just be. But if you are the kind of person that wants to articulate it and wants to talk about it because you have feelings and thoughts and yada, 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 isn't that a problem if you're not allowed to talk about it?
Yeah, growing up in New Zealand, I could absolutely understand the need for other people to, to have good role modelling and to see other people's stories like that. When you live in a small Pacific nation with 250,000 people, so Samoa is an island that has 220,000 people living on it. So when people are sort of growing up there, everyone just coexists together, and there's not a lot of people to be having those conversations with, because everybody knows your business. Within families and things. So I completely understand that there. when I came here, I felt that there was a different need for young people like myself who never ever saw anything queer apart from when it was sort of slightly on the television or, so there's a need for more people who have different needs. A lot of those in Samoa, a lot of the big fish in the pond end up moving for whatever reason. They're able to move from there and then sort of flourish in the great big blue sea. So I think depending on where you are, of course, we're all products of our environments. So different environments have different ways of being. That way of being in Samoa works for them. The way of being for us, whether we're from Adelaide, the UK, or Auckland, we have different ways of doing things, and there are different needs here, which then create the environment and how we end up living and becoming.
But I think, I don't want to labor on this. I think that there's a tension there for me that isn't quite resolved.
Right.
Like you've just said, some people will leave and go and flourish in a different environment. Yeah. But what I'm saying is, why can't they flourish there?
See, so for me, they are flourishing there. So
then why did you say some people have to leave to flourish?
Well, because as individuals, we all have different wants and needs, and some people have a much bigger picture for themselves than others. So I had two aunts that lived together. They were obviously gay. No one ever talked about it, but their life was really rich, and everybody knew what was going on with them. And so my father knew that his sister was living with a woman, but she could have easily have been living with a man, and she would have been received the same way. And yet, if she had come to New Zealand in those early days pre-law reform, she would have had a completely different reception here.
Different good, different bad?
Probably different bad.
Okay.
Same-sex relationships were frowned upon in New Zealand at that time. Yet they lived openly together as a couple, and everyone, even their church, accepted them. They never had a coming out. My father just said they always just were. So I could go there, I could just be who I was. And yet when I come here, there's a need for me to, maybe come out and people sort of see me as being visible. But there are lots of us that aren't visible who prefer to just, live. I just think for me, there was a different type of acceptance. There was an unwritten rule that you could actually be who you were, and it had always been like that.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm saying is there's as much of a need to be accepted on your own terms as on everyone else's terms. So the point you've just made about some people being out and proud and some people choosing not to, that's their choice. And that's wonderful. When you're in an environment where you don't have a choice, that's where I'm a bit more like,
well, yeah, and when we look at the freedoms we're afforded, there's still like 70 odd countries in the world where it's illegal to be gay.
Yeah.
So, and yet largely I've lived my life the way I've wanted to do it. And there are still people in the world who just can't even begin to fathom what it's like for us living our lives the way we do. So I just...
Well, and this makes me want to ask follow-up questions. So to me, it seems absurd that New Zealand didn't legalise homosexuality until the 80s, because the perception, as someone who grew up in Australia, is, New Zealand, they've got it all sorted out. They're so far ahead of us in terms of like being socially progressive and like knowing what's what. And it's just really fascinating that it wasn't until the 80s that it was decriminalised.
Well, yeah, it's only decriminalised because of the HIV. So part of, the homosexual law reform in New Zealand was in and around then it was illegal to be gay. People were presenting with HIV. There were no health services for people with HIV because they were invisible, because it was illegal. So to get it over the line, we needed not to be legal, and then we could then get health services for them. So it was a health issue, not a moral issue. So many people confused the two, and all they could see were dying men coming back from overseas with AIDS, and everybody was scared of us.
Yeah.
That time wasn't ideal, but it was probably the best time for it to happen. And had they not come along, it wouldn't have happened for a long time. I think New Zealand, whilst it can be largely conservative in lots of ways, growing up in a small town, like in Auckland, everyone knows your business here too, because there's, a handful of people that live here by comparison to anywhere else. But then I look at let's say the UK, they were in 1967. So they were well ahead. The law reform happened there in 1967. We were sort of 1986. Different needs call for sort of different action, really. And I guess, often it comes to a point where, people live under pressure for so long, and then it just explodes. There is only so long.
So what was that like for you growing up in that environment and being like, oh, maybe I'm illegal?
Yeah, but you never actually thought about it, because I never thought about being illegal until I started going to the clubs. And then all of a sudden, I went there with some friends who were dancers who were slightly older, who kind of snuck me in, because actually I was sort of 15 going on 16 when I went to the clubs. And in those days you had to be 20. But my experience...
20? Oh, it's like being in America. Wow.
Well, they're 21, aren't they?
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry. So that experience was, daunting in itself. But I now know lots of people who went clubbing in New Zealand or in Auckland when they were 14, 15 and 16. I don't think you'd get away with it now, but at the time, that's just the way it was. You would end up going clubbing at that time. And then, of course, I became more sort of socially aware of who I was and where I was. Because police would often come in to raid the place looking for people who were underage. So often what would happen then was there was a corridor that everybody, if the police come and you see police, go run out of this corridor, go down, there was a hiding place for the young people that everyone knew where to go to if the police came in for a raid.
How often did that happen?
Well, often they would just walk through and just have a bit of a nosy, and everyone would be like, I never ever saw them haul anyone out of there. I just saw them every now and then just do routine checks walking around, and there might have been 5, 6 or 7 police, which is quite intimidating in a small club space.
That is terrifying.
And I think there was an understanding too that they knew that was a safe space for people to be, given the illegality of it. It was a place where people could go to and could just be themselves for that short period of time. And I guess in those days, clubs closed. The bars closed at 1:30 and the club closed at 3 o'clock. So everyone was home by 3:30, 4 o'clock.
Still quite late. That seems a reasonable time
to
go
home. Well, it does now, yes. Even sometimes that's a bit late for me these days. So
you didn't really reflect on it until you were in those environments.
Until I was in those environments, because I think prior to that I was, I never thought about it while I was going to school. But in actual fact, I wasn't out at school. Everybody kind of knew I was gay. I knew that I liked men. I knew I liked boys. I have always loved boys. There was never a time in my life, even as a toddler, that I wasn't attracted to other boys.
As a toddler? No.
As a toddler, I remember sort of as a 4-year-old looking at my older cousin thinking he's very handsome and sort of always being attracted to other males.
Wow.
Loving females, given, I'm one of 8, so I have 5 sisters. I've got 3 sisters, me, and then 2 sisters. So really, there was like 6 girls in a row.
Yeah.
And I had 2 older brothers. But always been an effeminate side to the way I lived my life and the way I view life.
But you never thought like, oh, this is wrong. This is something that I should keep to myself.
Yeah, absolutely I did, because I was brought up in a Christian family.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so sort of from a faith perspective, I knew that was wrong. Well, according to the law of the Lord, it wasn't right. But actually, once I started going to the clubs and I worked out who I really was and what I really wanted, I was strong with it. I was fortunate that, my parents were people of faith, but they were really strong in they taught us how to stand our ground and to really not worry what other people thought. So I had got to the stage in my life so part of my thing was, regardless of what it was, to be able to put your point across, stand firm. I knew that it wasn't right in the church's teachings, and I knew that it didn't sit well with my family. I mean, I left the church when I started clubbing, basically. So by 16, I sat down and I had a talk, because I was going out clubbing on a Saturday and then coming home and sleeping and not going to church. My father was like, "What's going on here?" I sort of said to him, "Well, Dad, I'm gay and it doesn't sit right with the church's teachings." He said, "Look," I was really nervous about having that conversation. And he was great. He sort of said, Edward, we've brought you up in the way we think is right. That's now a relationship between you and God. If you don't want to go to church, that's fine. But if you live under our roof, then you have to sort of obey the way that, you've got to live the way we like to live. And I'm absolutely fine with that. So instead of going to church on a Sunday, I had to make Sunday lunch for when so they would come home and we would have a family meal together. We always ate together on a Sunday. That didn't change. I was just all of a sudden in the kitchen doing the cooking.
But like cooking a big family meal when you were hungover?
Well, I didn't really drink a lot in those days.
Oh, okay.
So, and people in the church were shocked that my father said that, because it wasn't too long before people started seeing, me, on the front of a parade in drag. And they were like, oh, look, that's that guy from the church. His family let him do that. So my dad was a lot better with my coming out than my mum.
Oh, interesting.
My father was a very gentle and kind man who just sort of took it in his stride. And so he allowed us to flourish in the land that they had come to. I'm one of 8. I don't know how they did it. How do you have 8 children and sort of keep them fed, clothed,
no idea.
keep them in line, and, raise productive people into society when everything is going against you? It's completely swimming upstream. That tenacity of spirit that not only came from, from being a migrant, but being a migrant that really people didn't want here. And then layer on top of that, children of migrants that are gay and that are queer and that do drag. It's really just, you're at the top of the heap of things that nobody wants their children to be.
So tell me about your mum's response. You said that it wasn't as positive as your dad's.
No, she was a tough nut, but I guess having 8 children, and she was running an army school while she was bringing us up, because there were so many of us. It was military precision in the way she operated. She wasn't harsh. She was just really firm, and she didn't play into any niceties. I think that she thought that being gay was going to be a harder life for me. She didn't want to see me having a harder life. So she ignored lots of elements of my life up until she realised that that things weren't so bad for me and that I wasn't an unhappy person, really. I think she always thought I was going to marry a woman and have children, and she was always trying to introduce me to girls. Even when I was doing drag, she was still always...
You could have doubled your wardrobe.
Well, I could have. And you know what? And that kind of tried me in the end. I ended up sort of, saying to my sisters once, I'm getting to the end of my tether here and I can just kind of walk away from the family. I'll walk away from her if I need to. It didn't come to that. There were tensions. And in the so bless her soul, she's an angel now. But our relationship towards the end of her life was completely different to the beginning of my life, which was a great thing. We'd come to a really nice understanding, and there were so many of us. They were working to kind of get ahead. She didn't have time to sort of pander to individual needs of children, but she wasn't very forthcoming. And a part of that too for me, I think, was her faith. I think my parents' generation's belief in faith is completely different to my siblings in the way they view faith. So even,
And there's also this other element of the pressure that you feel from the church, right? Like, and I mean by that, the people in the church. So once they know, what are they going to think of me? How am I going to talk to them every week? And that's kind of a bit confusing and gross to wade through.
Well, I think it was confusing for her. It wasn't confusing for my father. She just sort of said, no, that's my boy. And, my sisters were really... And it was when my father died, after his funeral, my older brothers sort of pulled me aside and, we were talking one night just as siblings do. And they were like, when you were born, not long after you were born or when you were young, a baby, toddler, Dad pulled us aside and said, your brother is completely different to you guys and you really have to look out for him.
Really?
Which was an incredible thing to hear all those years later as adults. So he knew straight away. He'd pull the boys aside and he was like, you always need to look after Edward. He's not like you two. So that insight into the kind of man he was to allow us to sort of, he knew that. It blew me away when I heard that. I just kind of thought he had a completely different way of looking at things that weren't typical for men of his age that came from the Pacific. I would never have thought that from him because he was very staunch and a very hard-working, God-fearing man. You know, my parents were firm but fair. They taught us the difference between right and wrong. And, you know, if we were out of line, we got it. But if we towed the line, there wasn't a lot of niceties in life as a child. There was a lot of love.
So tempting to go over that line, though, isn't it?
Well, it is really, you know. And I did, but I just never got caught.
Oh, yeah.
So it was part of playing that game, you know. I'm going off to a church group, youth group. The church is going bowling tonight and I'm staying at, you know, one of the boys' houses from church. That's fine. And then I'd go to the nightclub. There's only so many times before, how come your sisters aren't going to that church thing? Oh, they're doing something else.
Oh, you know, they're not interested. Yeah. Oh, let's change subject. So speaking of changing subjects, actually, let's go back to the club. So this club that you were going to when you were 15, was that the Staircase?
It was the Staircase.
Wow. Do you remember your first time there?
I do. The first time there, I was a bit nervous, but I was dancing.
Oh, why is that in inverted commas? Because you were doing it badly.
Yeah, I was doing it badly. I was dancing in a fashion show, so of course, if we look back at those things, they weren't very fashion at all. However, at the time, we thought they were. So everyone there was sort of slightly older than me, 3 or 4 years older. So they had already been clubbing for a little while. And one night after rehearsal, they were like, "We're going out. Would you like to come?" Absolutely, I went to come. So I went up there with them. I don't know how I got in. I was 15. No one asked for any ID. When I look at the photos, I look like a child going into a club. How do they let you in at that age? Anyway, so I went there for the first time and I had a great time. I went there one other time with them. It was an incredible experience given that, one, I was out late at night. Two, I was in amongst all of these incredible... Just a whole, you know, for me, it was a wild ride in life, seeing all these different types of people there, dancing. The music was always so good. I wasn't drinking then. And then I only went a couple of times with them, and then I parked it. But I always thought about that place, and I always thought, I'd really like to go there and be myself, because at that stage I hadn't really come out. It wasn't like I was going there to meet anyone, especially at that age, really. It wasn't about the sex.
But you'd been in love with boys since you were a toddler. Surely you were, by that stage, like, I need something.
Not at 15, although... No. So... And then there came a time of, you know, probably maybe 6 to 8 months after those first initial experiences that I wanted to go to that place and experience it for myself on my own.
Oh. So what, you're 15 or 16 and you were like, okay, yep, I'm going to go to that club on my own.
I'm going to go. I'm going to go by myself. But, you know, it took me at least 6 months to build up the courage because I'd always thought about it. I always really loved that I went there. And I kind of lived, the bus was an hour away from the city, 45 minutes. I had to catch a late bus on a Friday night. Yeah. So I do remember sort of catching the bus there. That was fine. Getting off in the city, I knew exactly where I wanted to go. But then actually walking past the door of the place several times before making the turn to go up the stairs. I remember that really vividly, that actually I was too nervous to go up those stairs, thinking someone might see me go up. Nobody knew me. So it just, who did I think was going to be looking at me when, you know, so who are you? No one knows who you are anyway. You're just another person walking up the stairs. Yet it took me so long before I went up those stairs. And then when I got up the stairs, having to pay the $5 cover charge, it was $3 before 11 and $5 after 11. I think I managed to get in on the $3 early bird special. Of
course. Money's tight, right, when you're 15?
Yeah, really.
So walking through then and going in that time when you went for the first time independently, tell me how that feels.
Yeah. I was really nervous and I was quite mortified with myself that, one, I was actually doing it, you know, and two, I had lied to my parents, basically. I sort of said I was staying the night at a friend's house. And I knew very well that I was deliberately going to be catching their bus and going into town just to go to this place. I did pluck up the courage to go in there because at those days, I think the bar opened at 9:30, and by then it was probably around 10:30. So 45 minutes to get there, 15, 20 minutes I've been sort of loitering in and around. And then, of course, I got up thinking that I was going to turn the corner and it was going to be as I remembered it. There was only a handful of people there because it was so early. So it was going through Pay Your Money, then walking around the corner to this massive empty room, bar a few of the early birds. So whilst it was really exhilarating, I I got in there, but there wasn't a lot of people in there.
Oh, see, I think it's a good thing when that happens because you can kind of acclimatize and adjust rather than being overwhelmed by people.
Yeah, no, you're right. It was. A lot of people were older than me. I managed to sort of end up talking to the DJ. Mm-hmm. His name was Tony, and he kind of took me under his wing, really. And he worked there, so I became friendly with him. And it turned out that he didn't live too far away from, my pub where I was living. So on the odd night, he would pick me up and he would go into work and do his DJing, and then he would drop me off on the way home. So that was kind of quite nice, really. He was a nice guy, and because he worked in the DJ box, I sort of, got a feel for the music and things they were playing, but he introduced me to a lot of people that worked there. So there wasn't long before then I, was collecting glasses and sort of working there part-time.
So you just kind of accidentally got a job.
Well, I did really accidentally got a job at 16 in a place where you shouldn't have been in the first place.
For another 4 years.
Well, yeah. And then I saw my English teacher. And so that was, I guess then I was in I was probably in the fifth form, 16, sixth form. So really of my last 2 years of high school. I changed high schools halfway through. But my English teacher from the first high school I was at turned up there one night. And I walked into the back of the bar with the glasses, and he was at the bar ordering a drink. Mr. Cowley, he called out, and then he sort of said, I always knew I would see you here one day.
Okay, so it didn't get inappropriate then?
It didn't get inappropriate, but he was always a very nice teacher. He was always very friendly. I always thought he was handsome too. Nothing ever happened, but a schoolboy crush. So that was kind of interesting, sort of seeing him there. And that's how I started working in the club.
And so how long from working there until just seeing the drag queens and being like, I want a bit of this?
Because I was still at high school then. So I did 2 more years at high school. So I was sort of working there while I was going to school. Mm-hmm. Everyone on the staff knew that I was still going to school, which was quite hilarious. And then, so that probably was around sort of 1984. So 85 was probably when they were starting to ramp up the idea of the law reform bill to change. So the conversations were happening on both sides. And at that stage, at the club, they were doing lots of fundraisers to raise funds for the lobbying of the law change. So really, that's probably how I ended up being so, clued up on what was going on, given that's what the club was doing. And I became more familiar and aware with, how lobbying went and what needed to happen. We were doing fundraisers, and then I kind of was doing I was a boy dancer in the show.
Aww. In your pants?
Yes, in my pants.
Oh, exciting.
Yes, and a waistcoat and a top hat. Nothing that exciting. But, and then I guess that's when, I would always be seeing the drag queens. They were always having so much more fun. And they had a better work life than, sort of working as a glassy and then working behind the bar and then doubling up to do being male dancer in the show, a boy dancer. So really that sort of was my first introduction to them. But given then the owners of the club, then I formed a relationship with them. And then school sort of finished, and then I went to go to university. So I moved to Sydney to go to uni. I had my 2 older brothers had lived in Sydney for many years. And one of my brothers was like, well, you should come here and go to uni. And I wanted to go there. It kind of got me away from my family and, experience life over there. But, he lived in Bondi Junction, and Bondi Junction is not far from Oxford Street. So it didn't take me long to find my way to Oxford Street. and, sort of see what was going on there and really experiencing Sydney in the heyday of the mid to late 80s.
So that's Sydney. And sorry, I'm going to like jump around the timeline here. After Sydney, you moved to the UK for 4 years and then you moved back to Auckland. And at that point, you came into co-ownership of the Staircase.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Having had worked there from when I was young, I always had a relationship with the guys, Dennis and Stuart, who were the owners of the club. And whenever I came back to New Zealand, we would catch up, or I'd go to the club and visit them, and we remained friendly. So then when I sort of moved back to New Zealand was probably in around sort of 1990, the early 90s, 1991.
And how old were you then?
1991, 28.
Okay.
25? No, 25. 26.
20-something.
Yes. Maybe I need to get my calculator out. I was moving back to Sydney, but of course I stopped off in Auckland to visit my family, and it was the summer holidays. I'd moved over summer. The boys were like, well, look, come and work at the club, and then when you get sorted, you can move back to Australia. So I was sort of spending the summer here, and then Dennis, one of the owners, sort of approached me. He sort of said, look, I've been doing this for a while now. It's time for me to step back. I'd, really love it if you wanted to pick up my shares. So, that was an incredible opportunity for me really then, because I had I didn't really have a lot of money to be able to buy those, but he worked out a payment plan and sort of said, well, while you're working, you can sort of pay it off. And, they sorted out a plan that sort of worked for both of us. So Dennis took a back seat. He moved out and then I moved into his role. And Dennis looked after front of house.
And so what was the decision-making process for you? Were you just all in straight away, or did you and ah?
Yeah, I thought about it really, because, I loved Sydney and I always thought I'd end up back there. But part of it for me then, it was in and around the opportunity that had presented itself. So one, to be a director of a company, and it was a successful club. And it was something that I knew. I had sort of done it while I was at school. A lot of the same people still worked there. Tony, the DJ, was still DJing there. And so it made sense really then. And also, I guess because I'd been away from my family for all of that time, for sort of, nearly 8 years really, I'd sort of been away from them, and I kind of thought it's time to come home. My sisters were having children and I didn't know my nieces and nephews. Part of, I think, the initial move for me going away from my family was in and around finding myself, living my own life and not really having them know what I was getting up to. But of course, that had all changed really when I sort of saw my nieces and nephews. I had a really strong relationship with my aunts and uncles, but that was purely because they were planted firmly within our family unit. My parents always had family over, so we always knew them. And I kind of thought, well, me living in Australia is not going to make me connected to my nieces and nephews. So it was an opportunity to be with my family and just sort of, be home for a while. And then, of course, it was like, well, being director of a company, of something that I was already familiar with, it kind of changed the trajectory of things, because I was able to then sort of buy into a already established business and, get some savings behind me.
But so thinking back to that time when you were first made that offer, how much of you is excited and how much of you is terrified? Put a number on it for me. Percentages.
I was very excited, probably 80% excited.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Is that the gift of youth? Because I'm sitting here like, oh my God, that's terrifying.
For me, it was an opportunity that those sort of opportunities don't come along very often. In terms of sort of an established business owner having trust to bring you into the fold when I didn't have any capital behind me to offer. So it was for, they were sort of like, I'd like to sell you my shares. I'm gifting you these. And then, from your director's fees, you'll pay me back this much, monthly. And it still gave me a really good wicket to sort of, live on and save. I was able to buy my first home within 12 months of, being involved in that business. And I must have been 20, because I bought my first home when I was 25. So
Wow.
I know, I look back at it now and I'm like, how did that happen? And for me, it was the right place at the right time. And also, having created those relationships that had sort of lasted, because by then I'd known those boys for sort of 10 years.
It was still terrifying though, right? It's still kind of terrifying.
Oh, yeah, but the thing was, it was established and there were 3 owners in there. There were 3 partners at the time, so I took over one of them. The other 2 were still in there. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were slightly long in the tooth. When I said they were long in the tooth, they were probably, 12, 15 years older than I was. But I suppose, it probably wasn't that old, but, ancient for them, given their... So part of my role was in around, I took over front of house and the operations of the day-to-day running of the club. We were looking for a front of house person and we couldn't find one. So that's when it took a serious step for me because I ended up becoming the front of house person. So then part of that for me was in and around, fostering an environment that I wanted to be inclusive and I wanted it to be, a friendly, warm atmosphere that people could come and forget all about their everyday, given, life is really hard for young queer people or for queer people in general. And also New Zealand being so small, we'd come out of the homosexual law reform sort of changed in 1986, and this was probably sort of the late 80s, early 90s, really. And there was still a lot of people not living the way they should be living, not living openly, finding it really difficult. So to create a safe space where people could come, just be themselves was really paramount in terms of what we saw. And also Auckland is a tiny place. So we have the same people coming to the club every week in, week out. So in terms of fostering an environment that, made them feel safe and appreciated, as opposed, our audience was the same audience. So, we had to keep things... I wanted it to be as friendly as they could, a place that they could call home, really, which was an environment that we fostered, really.
Is that where the character of Buckwheat formed because you wanted to be creating this environment and you needed someone that was kind of warm and welcoming, or did Buckwheat exist before then?
Part and parcel of the culture that I grew up in was in and around whenever people come to your home, you make it their home. So when I look back at the way I sort of live, it made sense that followed a natural progression. Because culturally, it's important for Samoan people to be hospitable to people who are in their environment. When initially, that was the environment I wanted to create, and a lot of the young drag queens at the time were Samoan. So
interesting.
It just culturally, it was attuned for us to be hospitable. So that just sort of flowed over into work. But also that's the way I live, and that's the way we were at the time. Drag was often just tolerated in New Zealand, in New Zealand gay clubs or in New Zealand clubs, really. So we sort of took it out of the back rooms and kind of brought it out. But there wasn't a whole changing time because Priscilla had not long. Well, the movie had come out and it sort of changed the way drag was perceived right across Australasia. So all of a sudden it went from being in back club rooms to, coming to a Priscilla event. So I did the launch for Priscilla when it came to New Zealand, along with the drag queens from the club, which was really the first time we kind of went out in public. Because prior to that, really, we got ready in the room, that back room, we came into the show, and then I got changed and I left. So the only people who saw drag were people who were in the clubs.
And so why did the staircase close?
Probably fatigue in the end, really. I just think it ran its course. Then ended up, in its last guys, it moved to a really big venue, like a super club venue, and it didn't sustain it being there. By then, we were well post law reform, and gay people weren't necessarily going to gay clubs. They were going everywhere. You could go anywhere. There were lots of bars and clubs on Ponsonby Road and restaurants that never, weren't traditionally safe places for gay people. All of a sudden, they were going there, which was fine. It's all part of... But it just ended up... And I was kind of getting long in the tooth, and I just... I always maintained if and when it got too much for me, I would like give it up. I just needed a change of direction, really. I'd worked nights for so many years.
Yeah.
And I was sort of pushing into my 30s, and I just was like, I needed a change, really.
Well, so this decision to close the club, how did that feel when you'd made it?
If there was a sense of relief that it was coming to an end, and then when it actually came to an end, there was a sense of loss and grief.
Yeah, because I imagine you talked about it for ages, and like you ummed and ahed for ages before that final decision.
And it was just, there was a big sense of grief for a long time. And then once I sort of worked out, actually, it's okay for me to sort of be living like everyone else and being awake during the day and having a full day and going to bed earlier than night. It took a long time to go, after working nights for so many years. All of a sudden, to be in bed or 8:30, 9 o'clock, winding down instead of thinking, oh, God, I've got to be in the club at 9:30 to open up, was sort of that took a while too.
So what do you think the staircase taught you about yourself?
It taught me a sense of community and a life of service, really. For me, there's lots of crossovers about being Samoan. I have being Samoan, they have a Matai village system, and as you get older, there are family chieftain titles that are bestowed upon you should you so desire. So my mum's family I've got a chieftain title, and it's Leala Ilepule. So that's part of a proverb, and the proverb is Oleala Ilepule Ole Tautua. And when you translate that into English, it's the road to leadership is through service. So when you look at that name, and I look at the way my life has been, it's been a life of service. And that name keeps me on track. Anytime I feel like integrity is slipping, or I feel that if I want to take shortcuts, I look at that name and I'm like, I can't do it. It just keeps me in check. So it's taught me a life of service, and that was in and around community service, and to sort of uphold community first and foremost, whether they be my family community, my Pacific community, my queer community, or whoever I'm working for at the time. I now do a lot of work in health, Pacific health. I do a lot of health research, but that's in and around uplifting well-being for people. It also taught me about people, and that we are many and varied, and there is no such one thing. I'm never surprised about people anymore, which is an odd thing. I don't, people are many and varied. They've all come from a different perspective. Each of them is valid. Lots of them aren't the same as me, but that doesn't matter. I've learned to be a lot more relaxed about things. I used to be really, really uptight in my 30s. And understanding that you can't control everything, and you don't have to control everything. Sometimes you've got to leave the space open for things to flourish. The cracks in the armour are where the sun goes through, and when the sunlight goes through, that's where things flourish.
If you loved hearing Edward's story, then why not give him a little follow on social media and then let him know? He can be found primarily on Instagram, where he is at Buckwheat_drag_diva. And whilst you are on Instagram, why not follow Lost Spaces at Lost Spaces Pod? I can also be found on Facebook and TikTok at the same handle, Lost Spaces Pod. And before I let you go, one more quick reminder about the newsletter Queer Word, which comes out every Friday and shares a fun, well, maybe they're not always fun, but they're informative words and the history behind them and how we've come up with all of these interesting little queer descriptions of life circumstances and other bits and pieces. As I said, the link is in the show notes for this episode. The newsletter goes out every Friday. I would love to be in your inbox more, so come join me. Okay, I've made it weird. I'm sorry to make it weird. Why don't I sign off for now? I will see you next week.